Hi everyone, and welcome to this video looking at a tropical cyclone example in a developed country. So you will have your example for perhaps a developing or an emerging country, and this is basically your example then for a developed wealthy country. You may have looked at a slightly different example depending on obviously your setting. We're going to look at focusing today on the 2005 Hurricane Katrina tropical cyclone which took place. So just a little bit of context for you then. Obviously, Hurricane Katrina struck the United States of America, which is our example or would be an example of a developed country. It was a Category 3 storm. So in terms of our Saffir-Simpson scale, which runs from 1 through to 5 being most severe, it was kind of in the middle, mid-ground. Storm surge height, so all that kind of flood water that tropical cyclone will bring with it. When it makes landfall was 6 meters, so that's obviously a good height. Number of deaths 1,800 deaths, and then economic damage in US dollars was $100 billion. I think there's two things to focus on here on this slide. First of all, on the right, from the image, you can clearly see the level of destruction and devastation that was experienced by those people in places where Hurricane Katrina made landfall, namely sort of New Orleans, etc. But I think the second thing to say here as well would be this would be a really nice place to kind of pause and just look at some of those statistics in terms of that tropical cyclone and compare that to your example for a developing country, because that's what the exam board really like. They like you to take your developing example, kind of compare them side by side and think about actually to what extent does development impact on how severe the consequences are. So when we look at Hurricane Katrina, we're going to look at kind of preparation, management, and responses, basically. And we're going to do that for sort of 5 key things. We're going to do a little bit on forecasting, look a little bit at warning and evacuation, look at defences, environmental impacts, and then social impacts as well. So in terms of forecasting, well, obviously, as you would expect, USA is very, very rich. So because of that, they have a very sophisticated monitoring system, which is able to predict when, where a hurricane is likely to strike. And then they can kind of manage the impacts of that a little bit. So, for example, they've got the NHC, which is the National Hurricane Center in Florida, which tracks and predicts hurricanes using satellite images and planes that collect data on the weather and the conditions of the approaching storm. So they are able to predict where the storm will make landfall. They're also able to predict where the path of the storm will potentially go. They've got this very sophisticated, very advanced technology, which a lot of other countries naturally don't have. So that's a real positive, because what that means in the long term is they should be able to evacuate with plenty of time. So they should be able to, therefore, begin to reduce death tolls, reduce injuries, and so on and so forth. Equally, anyone that is being a bit stubborn and perhaps doesn't want to leave, they've got that time to prepare themselves as well. So feeding into that kind of then is warning and evacuation. So obviously National Hurricane Center issued a hurricane warning a few days in advance for numerous states, and those states that they had a staggered level of severity, I suppose, for certain states. So they tracked the hurricane, providing updates via the government on where it was likely to hit. This is also where you kind of see better infrastructure come into play as well. Because if the infrastructure is there, internet, phone lines, TV networks, etc., they've got a much better opportunity of reaching more people in order to alert them and make them aware of what's going on. If you're in a country whereby you don't have that, then you're going to struggle to get in touch with people. If you can send a warning out on a phone, if you can send it out via radio, television, email, whatever it might be, you're going to reach more people, and therefore you're more likely to reduce some of those impacts. Some US states declared a state of emergency, with 70 to 80% of residents being evacuated before the hurricane made landfall. Again, that is important for two reasons. One, because it reduces death toll, but also two, to evacuate those people, you're going to need services in place to do that. So you're going to need institutions such as the armed forces, the police force, the fire service, etc., to be able to move those people on. And also in terms of politics, political figures were ordering evacuations of the city with plenty of time. So the mayor was saying, this is when it's likely to make landfall. You need to therefore leave to protect yourselves. So again, it's having those officials able to make those decisions that gives people the confidence. Okay, when the NHC issues a hurricane warning, we know it's actually going to happen because we've got this sophisticated technology. What a lot of other countries that perhaps aren't as well developed as the USA do, which lets themselves down often, is they either don't give enough time for warnings, or the technology isn't as good, so the track of the storm isn't very accurate. So people say, well, last time this happened, we couldn't evacuate in time, or we evacuated and nothing happened. We're not going to trust it this time. So the fact that we've also got reliable technology, but also those political figures that can make those decisions, really restores people's trust as well. Because of that, then also we've got defences that are in place, which is really important. So many cities, including New Orleans, had defences already in place to protect against storm surges. Many homes were also equipped to deal with the hurricanes. They had flood barriers and shutters on windows to prevent broken glass, etc., causing injury. And that also helps in ensuring that not as many people are displaced, because ultimately, the more damage the storm does, the more the long-term cost is going to be. So a key thing that we have to remember here is the USA has that money to spend initially, because in theory, that money spent now helps to keep costs down in the future in terms of repair. However, what we also have to remember is that in the case of New Orleans, 80% of the city was underwater because some of the embankments failed. Okay, some of those embankments failed due to the volume of water, and we could link that to climate change. But some of the embankments also failed kind of as a result because they weren't maintained. They didn't have that investment to keep them going. Because of that, then, obviously, there were significant impacts. Some of the impacts we're going to focus on are the environmental impacts here. So a lot of coastal habitats, such as turtle breeding beaches, obviously were damaged, areas of kind of natural beauty, which again has devastating consequences for not only kind of that ecosystem and biodiversity in that area, but also it's really important to think about and consider the impact on tourism for places like that as well. Again, similarly, conservation areas were destroyed. Half of Breton National Wildlife Refuge in Louisiana was washed away. So again, some of that will be quite natural. Some of that will have been maintained for a purpose. Again, thinking about local people jobs, thinking about international tourism and that sort of thing. And then in terms of further environmental impacts, flooding led to damage of oil refineries in Louisiana, which again caused major oil spills. So again, jobs, income in terms of some of those companies and those organisations, so contributions to GDP, importing and exporting oil. But I think importantly as well, oil spills have huge environmental impacts. Okay, they can lead to ignition of the oil, which again can cause sort of localized fires. The oil increases the density of the water, so for any kind of wildlife that lives within the water, it can cause kind of suffocation. It can, animals as well, in terms of their coats, fur coats can become quite thick, sticky, sort of highly viscous, which again can have detrimental impacts on them as well. Importantly, then, social impacts, as we've already said, 1,800 people were killed. It'd be really interesting to compare that to, you may have done Typhoon Haiyan, for example, looking at sort of comparing the death toll of Hurricane Katrina to your emerging or developing example that you've got. 300,000 houses were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were made homeless. So that's us thinking about building costs, insurance costs, also somewhere to kind of house these people as well while they are displaced. 3 million people left without electricity. Again, that can impact mental health for a start. That can impact hospitals, schools, all that sort of infrastructure. Also getting out messages to emergency services and local authorities as well. Roads were damaged and bridges collapsed. Again, communities, areas, vulnerable people potentially becoming cut off, unable to get from one place to another. It can impact emergency services because rescue efforts are significantly delayed. Very, very problematic in terms of that. 230,000 jobs were lost from damage to businesses. So again, thinking about multiplier effect of that. Tourism, people have just lost their homes. It's going to cost them money. They now haven't got a source of income in order to be able to help them rebuild. Also, the idea of being able to rebuild within kind of the realms and the remit of, well, we've got no customer base, for instance, we've got no tourists coming in or whatever it might be, and having to rebuild some of that key infrastructure to be able to sort of promote that. And then FEMA, who are the Federal Emergency Management Agency, were unprepared for the scale of the disaster and actually struggled to cope with the sheer volume of people who needed support. So in terms of them, the organisation that people have put their trust in to manage this, mitigate the risks, help people, ensure that they are safe, actually are saying, because of various different reasons, this isn't something that we can do at the moment. This isn't something that we're able to help with as best as we would like. So then again, that can put pressure and strain on fire brigade, the armed forces, and so on and so forth. So again, it doesn't help with that kind of management there. So that very much was kind of a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Hurricane Katrina. There's a couple of things that you can do. Consider the impacts of Hurricane Katrina. How did the USA, being a developed country, help the authorities to cope? Not saying that the responses, as we've seen on the previous slide, were necessarily perfect, but development certainly would have helped and supported the USA and some of those key states and cities to be able to cope with the impacts of Katrina much better than perhaps another example that you've looked at. Compare Katrina, go back to that second slide we looked at, compare Katrina to your developing example. Were the impacts of Katrina worse or better? Was the death toll higher? Was homelessness higher? Was the actual cost of the damage higher? And consider the reasons as to why that may be. And then again, it says there at the bottom, examiners really like these types of questions. Look at the impacts of your two case studies. Look at the responses of your two case studies. Look at the level of preparation of your two case studies. Can you compare those two events? Often, the examiners for EdXLB like you to either be comparing impacts, responses, and preparation, or they like you to look at comparing developing, emerging, to a developed example and sort of say, actually, what was the straw that broke the camel's back? Was it the financial means, or was it actually everything else that meant that the impacts were more or less for this example? So it's a really good thing. Maybe create a couple of flashcards so that you can easily compare one example to the other and know how did preparation, response, impact influence what happened overall. How did development impact death toll, homelessness, social, economic, environmental impacts, etc.?